This video is a collaboration with Eva from the Queen of Sweetness. We've both made a pumpkin-themed cake, so check hers out too. The link is in the description box below. My cake is a pumpkin piñata with a candy surprise inside. I'm using 4 6-inch layers of my perfect chocolate cake. I'm cutting a hole in the middle of my first layer using a round cookie cutter, lining it up in the center and pushing down to cut all the way through the cake. I'm saving the center cutout to make the stalk of my pumpkin. I'm doing the same for 3 of my layers, leaving the 4th layer intact. I've leveled my layers with a serrated knife to take off the domed tops and drizzled them with simple syrup to keep them moist. I have 3 layers with a hole in the middle and 3 little circles, and now I'm ready to build my cake. I've made half a batch of my 4-minute buttercream frosting and added orange gel food colour to get a nice pumpkin-y shade of orange. I'm sticking a 6-inch cake board onto my turntable with masking tape so it doesn't slide around, and using a few dabs of buttercream to secure my first layer of cake. Now I'm spreading on my buttercream filling, not putting on too much because I don't want it to bulge out of the sides of my cake. I've chilled my cake layers in the freezer for about 30 minutes to firm them up so I don't have many crumbs coming off the cake and getting into my filling. Another layer of cake, and more filling, leaving the hole in the middle open. This is going to be a chamber in the middle of the cake, which I'm going to fill with Halloween candy to spill out when it's cut, like a piñata. Now my 3rd layer of cake with a hole in. I'm going to coat the central chamber with melted chocolate. This will lock in the moisture where I cut the cake with my cookie cutter. I'm not using frosting because I don't want it to get all over the candy I'm going to put in the chamber. The melted chocolate will set and form a nice, non-stick barrier between the cake and the candy. I'm using an offset spatula to spread the chocolate, going all the way up to the top and all the way down to the bottom. The turntable makes it easier to smooth the chocolate all around the chamber. Since my layers are chilled, the chocolate is beginning to set, but I'm going to put it in the freezer for just a few minutes to speed it up. This is the candy that will be in the middle of my cake. They're M&Ms, but they taste like candy corn. Very Halloween-y. Okay, my cake is ready. You can see the chocolate has set because it's not shiny anymore. I'll pour my candy in, all the way up to the top, and take out one that's sticking up over the top of my cake layer. Yum. Another layer of filling, and this will stick to my top layer of cake, sealing off the candy chamber. Now we have to make this cake look like a pumpkin. I'm using a serrated knife to carve the cake while it's still cold, so it doesn't crumble and fall apart. I'm starting at the top, cutting with little back and forth motions at a diagonal around the cake to begin the curve of the top of the pumpkin. I'm going around a few times, cutting off a bit more each time. I'm not carving a dip in the center of the top of the pumpkin because I don't want to cut too close to the candy chamber in the center of the cake. Next, I'm trimming the sides, going down, 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 making sure the sides are smooth. A little bit more around the top to make it curve gradually into the sides, and carving out the bottom at an angle to create the curve of the base of the pumpkin. My cake board is bigger than my cake, so now that I've carved it, I'm trimming it with my scissors so it's the same size as my cake. This is totally optional. It saves me from having to clean the cake board after frosting it because I'll put it on a clean, bigger cake board after that. I'm frosting my cake with more orange buttercream, using an offset spatula to spread it over the cake. I'm gliding the spatula from side to side without lifting it off the frosting. When I do lift my spatula, I'm always pulling it off the frosting at an angle instead of lifting it straight off so that it doesn't lift the frosting and cake with it. I'm going to cover the cake with fondant so the frosting doesn't need to be beautiful, but ideally it won't be filled with crumbs. I don't want it to be too thick because I want the fondant to hold its shape. After covering my cake with frosting, I'm smoothing it out with my frosting scraper, angling it around the curve at the bottom of the pumpkin and at the top. Ta-da! The foundation of my pumpkin piñata cake. For the stalk of the pumpkin, I'm using 2 of the cutouts from the center of my cake layers. I've attached them onto a cake board using a dab of buttercream, and I'm putting chocolate buttercream in the middle. I'm frosting it with chocolate buttercream, using my offset spatula, and the cake is a bit wobbly because it's so lightweight, but the frosting makes it heavier and it gets easier as I go. This is also easier when the cake is cold. Once the cake is covered with frosting, I'm using my frosting scraper to smooth it out, on the sides and on the top. I've chilled the stalk and now I can place it on top of my pumpkin, securing it with a bit of buttercream. I'm rolling out orange fondant as thin as I can and using this fondant cutter to trim strips of equal width. Now I'm using the cutter to cut into the sides of the fondant and then going along again to cut halfway between each line. These are the tassels that will cover my piñata. Continuing with more strips. If you don't have a fondant cutter, you can use a ruler and cut along each side with a pizza cutter or a sharp knife. Then just cut into the sides of the strip with your knife. I'm starting at the bottom of my cake and attaching a strip of tassels. For this first strip, I'm letting the bottom of the tassels rest on the cake board, as they would naturally for a real piñata, and also because it makes sure the base of the cake is covered up. If you finish wrapping the cake and still have tassels left on your strip, just cut off the extra tassels with a knife or scissors. Before sticking the next strip onto the cake, I'm brushing the top of the previous strip with a bit of water. I've chilled my cake to make sure it holds its shape while I'm pressing these strips onto it, so the frosting is firm and not very sticky, and this water is really important. To apply the tassels, I find it easiest to lay them down around the base of the cake and then lift up a section at a time. This way, the fondant is less likely to tear than if you try to apply the entire strip at once. As I wrap the strips around the cake, I'm trying to keep them level at the same height and making sure they cover the top part of the strip below. I'm also being careful not to stretch the strip, because if the tassels fan out, they'll expose the frosting of the cake underneath. After each row of tassels, I'm checking to make sure all of the frosting is covered, and if there's any showing through, I can just stick on an extra tassel to cover it up. It's best to do this before applying the next row of tassels, so you're not trying to lift tassels to squeeze more tassels underneath them. If you don't have quite enough tassels to finish a row, don't stretch the strip because you'll leave gaps in the coverage and see the frosting underneath. Instead, just stick on a few more tassels from another strip. Now that I'm at the top of the cake, instead of applying the strip in a straight line around the sides of the cake, I'm sticking them flat down in a circle, in a ring around the cake. So the tops of the tassels will overlap themselves a bit, and the bottoms will fan out, so it's really important to push them together to make sure the cake is covered. The final orange strip should go right up to the base of the stalk. Now I'm rolling out brown fondant very thinly and using the same fondant cutter technique to make the tassels for the stalk. I'm wrapping the brown fondant around the stalk, cutting my strips so I just have 4 or 5 tassels at a time to make it easier to wrap them around this narrow part of the cake. For the top of the stalk, I'm cutting out 2 circles of fondant using these cookie cutters. Now I'm cutting tassels into the circles using my knife, angling the knife around the circle to always cut towards the center of the circle. The large circle is the size of the top of the stalk. To choose the size for the small one, I found something that would expose the same amount of the previous tassels as the strips around the cake did. I'm pressing my big circle onto the top of the stalk and attaching the smaller one with some water. I'm brushing off any powdered sugar from the fondant and the cake board using a damp paintbrush. And here's the finished result. But the fun bit is about to happen. I'm going to cut into my pumpkin piñata to get to the candy inside. If you cut a shallow slice, you'll see the pretty layers of cake inside. But if you cut a bit further in, ta-da! Thanks for watching! Remember to check out this video by Eva from the Queen of Sweetness to see her make a pumpkin cake using whipped cream. If you've enjoyed this tutorial, please subscribe to my channel. I share a new cake decorating tutorial every week.